Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. This is Tom, your host. I was hoping to catch up with Brad tonight, but so far no go, so I guess I'm going to give it a try on my own tonight. Again, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining me. This evening I got a number of things to talk about, including some current events, and then I want to do a little bit of brush up on the things we discussed a couple of weeks ago on the show that was concerning the fundamentals of liberty. Some interesting things to talk about regarding that. Anyway, I guess so. Maybe more descriptive. What we're going to go is I don't know if anybody saw Laura Ingraham on the media buzz with Howard Kurtz. Actually, I think it was not this past Sunday, the Sunday before. That's one thing. There's also an article talking about a drilling company could force a Pennsylvania landowner to allow fracking under their land. I thought that was a good one. And then there's another article that's entitled 10 Questions Libertarians Can't Answer and Hope You Won't Ask, which I found that one quite comical. Anyway, and then again, the feature segment tonight, we're going to talk about clarifications or add-ons to the things we talked about 2 weeks ago on the fundamentals of liberty. And in particular on that, I wanted to get to part of a book entitled Beyond Democracy, and more specifically, a big part of that will be about voting. So with that, let's move on. If anybody wants to get a hold of us, of course, you can do that on Facebook at Annoying Peasant Radio is our site there, and we're also on Twitter at A Peasant Radio. So join us or follow us on Twitter. That'd be cool. I was spending some time on there today, and there's a whole lot of interesting stuff. If you start following people that are involved, at least in any way, shape, or form with the liberty movement, just tons of information winging by. So look forward to that, and look forward to getting some more followers there. So with that, let's go back to Laura Ingraham. She was on Media Buzz with Howard Kurtz, and for those of you who don't really know what that is, Howard Kurtz does I think it's strictly on Sundays, a weekly Sunday show, and he talks about the media basically, and I guess critiques them. And what was interesting about that, he had a guest on, Laura Ingraham, and she has a very successful radio show, and she's also a frequent guest on Fox News Channel, and also a frequent guest and sometimes a guest host on the O'Reilly Factor. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this exchange between Howard Kurtz and Laura Ingraham. And what I really want to say is, in their discussion, the topic came up about, the commonplace panels that are on Fox News and many of the other news channels, the mainstream media. And they started talking about that. So Howard Kurtz starts with, he says, the segments, we've all seen too many of them. You bring on somebody from the left, somebody on the right. They spew talking points at each other. Do you think that it is getting kind of tired? So Ingraham responds, I do to a certain extent. I mean, look, especially when someone comes on and recites the same points that we've heard from the establishment in both parties that frankly have screwed over the American people time and time again on issue after issue, which I'll have much to say about that in a moment. But Kurtz goes on and says, I like when guests surprise me. I do too, Ingraham says. So I think this has happened with me on a number of occasions on Fox News, where I'll be on a panel with a number of conservatives, whether it was George Will or Paul Wolfowitz, and we have real disagreements. And I think that's good, right? Because there are real disagreements on the conservative movement, on immigration, foreign policy, on how we should cut or not cut the military or foreign aid. These are important issues, and it's vibrant. I think it's much more exciting, and I can tell from Twitter hits, YouTube hits, web conversations, people appreciate that. They want to know what is going on around the table isn't just scripted. It's everyone is going to, well, the GOP has the answers, the Democrats have the answers. In fact, I think we can conclude that both parties haven't had the answers for the American people in a long time. I guess I'll comment on that segment first is, well, Yeah, and referring to her little earlier statement in that thing, she said where the conservatives have real disagreement. I might argue, I would think they're splitting hairs. What I mean by that is they're, of course, don't object to the basic concept of the state for them confiscating your wealth. They don't have any problem with that. It's just what they're going to do with your wealth afterwards. And that's nothing virtuous can come from that, I would argue, because the initial action is theft. So nothing virtuous can come from a theft. But she further admits that the GOP essentially doesn't have. She says, in fact, I think we can conclude that both parties haven't had the answers. Well, I would argue the reason is because their initial act is one of theft or an immoral act. Well, that's why nothing good can really come from that. But as usual, I would argue the left and the right are missing the main point, and they have to, because they've already accepted the notion that your money is their money, your property is their money. They don't respect property rights. So they don't see the disrespect of property rights as a problem, unless, of course, something happens to them personally. Then they might have a little bit of a problem. But they don't have the problem with it ideologically. They just, hey, you just kind of screwed me over, and so they get upset about it. But they don't have a problem screwing anyone else over or disrespecting their property rights. So anyway, my point there was, I thought, two things. If you want to hear the same old tired stuff, then listen to the mainstream media. The objective with the Annoying Peasant Radio show is to say something different and to give the foundation of why it's different. And I think that's very important. And I think people have an opportunity to learn then, not just hear the same old thing and repeat the same old thing. That gets us to where we are, which I think quite a number of people would agree is not a good place. So with that, let me move on and get back to my order so I know try to keep with how I introduce things. Yes, it was the drilling company. I thought that was interesting. So I read the title of this article, and let me see if it's actually dated March 31st. And this is from Climate Progress, their website. And well, I actually think the location is thinkprogress.org, and it's /climate and a bunch of other stuff. But this is interesting, and let me read you the title. And it says, and I'm going to read it verbatim. It says, drilling company could force Pennsylvania landowners to allow fracking under their land. And I've seen this story in a couple locations. One, I've seen a video of a woman who owns a few acres of property, and the deal is landowners typically pool their land together into larger parcels and then lease them to oil companies. Well, the problem is if you have all kinds of neighbors that want to lease to a certain company and you, in fact, don't want to, ultimately, of course, you cause a logistical problem for the oil company, right? They're going to be drilling under your land in a horizontal fashion or potentially vertically. I assume they wouldn't do that on your property if you were the objector to the drilling. But in this case, there's that owner that owns a relatively small piece of land that does not want this done. Well, by the headline, you say, well, wait a minute, this oil company is going to force her to do this. And again, let me read it specifically. It says drilling company could force Pennsylvania landowners to allow fracking under their land. Well, and then here's the story. Again, I'm on thinkprogress.com. The first line of the actual story is, an old state law in Pennsylvania could allow an energy company to force landowners to allow oil and gas drilling under their land, even if the law that allows, again, these oil companies to bundle properties of people who don't sign drilling leases with their neighbors who do. So my point on this is, by the headline, you see it as, wow, the oil company is going to force these people to do that, when in fact, it's a 1961 Pennsylvania law that forces property owners to allow drilling under their properties, on their properties. And I just see this as a further statement of the in these oil companies. Quite a few of them, in fact, are not. But my point is, the only reason they're able to do this, is specifically again in this case, is because of a law passed in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's in fact not the oil company that's forcing them to do that. It's the law that forces you to do this. And ultimately, in a vast majority of cases, it is in fact a law that forces one to do things. No one else can really force you to do that unless, of course, they directly use coercion and forcibly make you do something. Anyway, I just thought that was very interesting because I think it's how people are continuously misled about the state. And I think it appears to me that they may have purposefully done that and tried to make this look like the oil company was doing this, when in fact the oil company could not have done this without the assistance of the state. That leads me to another one, just a quickie on the side. I don't know if anybody else has seen this one. I thought this was very interesting. But I don't know, do people know of the Koch brothers? Billionaires, U.S. billionaires, I believe from Oklahoma somewhere. It might be Tulsa. Let's see, I can't remember. One of the brothers is Charles. I can't remember the other brother's name off the top of my head. But what happened was Harry Reid made a comment about the Koch brothers. Part of the deal is, of course, the Koch brothers a lot of times use financial backing to back Republican or conservative candidates. And of course, why would they spend millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands, whatever I'm sure over time it's been in the millions that they've spent a lot. And of course they do this to get favors or to get legislation passed. And people say, well, it hurts them too. Yes, but if they know it's going to hurt their competitors more, obviously they'd be willing to do that. Right? So in other words, they're trying to get the law to do what they can't themselves do, just like in the previous example in the state of Pennsylvania with the fracking. So anyway, Harry Reid ultimately winds up, they use different tactics. In this case, it's the Democrats using against the Republicans. And one of the tactics they've used, of course, is they directly attack the Republican competitor. And I know a hotly contested area this fall is going to be North Carolina. Because the Republicans definitely want to regain control of the Senate, and a pivotal seat is going to be the one held in North Carolina. So that's already a big battleground that started there. So one of the tactics that Harry Reid's using is also to attack the Koch brothers as maybe a bit of a new tactic. And this article, and I actually did hear Mr. Reid, the speaker, the leader of the Senate, majority leader, I guess you'd call him, where he spoke about saying that Koch brothers are, trying to get buy America. They're un-American, I know was one of the terms he used. There was quite a few other terms he used, and I believe it was Charles Koch. He did an op-ed, or he put an ad in paper. I believe it was the New York Times. That may not be correct. I'm trying to do this off memory. Anyway, his response is in this article. I just thought I'd read this. I thought it was pretty interesting. He says, instead of encouraging free and open debate, collectivists strive to discredit and intimidate opponents. They engage in character assassination, I should know, as the almost daily target of their attacks. This is the approach that Arthur Schopenhauer described in the 19th century that Saul Alinsky famously advocated in the 20th, and that so many despots have infamously practiced. Such tactics are the antithesis of what is required for a free society and a telltale sign that the collectivists do not have good answers. Now, I've heard, I'll talk a little bit here about what Harry Reid says and thing. This goes on. He says, rather than to try to understand my vision for a free society or accurately report the facts about Coke Industries, our critics would have you believe we're un-American and trying to rig the system, that we're against environmental protection or eager to end workplace safety standards. These falsehoods remind me of the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's observation, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. So he's trying to set the record straight, of course, in response to what Senator Reid had to say about him. And he goes on to say that we employ 60,000 people, blah, blah, blah. So he's trying to defend himself. And again, I also cannot tell you that the Koch brothers are a bunch of angels. But you know, what goes on here is interesting because I think most people do not understand the terms that Charles Koch used. In other words, he used the term collectivists. I think a lot of people don't know what that is. He says he used the term free society. Again, I think most don't know what that really is. And those are some of the things that I think are different about the Annoying Peasant Radio show. We can bring, or we do bring to our listeners a definition of those terms, and then we try to show what those things would look like in practice. And in many cases, they're already practiced, just not on the scale and in certain industries that are monopolized, of course, by the state, and not in the scale of the state at the moment. That's not to say anarchist, mechanisms aren't in place now on a huge scale, and they are, and the internet would be one of those many examples that I could cite, but we could go into great detail on that at another show. But that's my basic point there, that I think the Annoying Peasant Radio show can bring something different than what you hear on mainstream media, and that's what we're here to do. I also saw that commenting on this was Kevin Carson, who has been on the show as a guest with us, and he had a commentary entitled Charles Koch Clutches Pearls, Dies of Moral Rectitude. And that was an interesting article or commentary that he had there. His angle on this was basically the part that, well, Charles Koch really isn't an angel, and a lot of the things he cited in his defense were not necessarily true, at least not in the eyes of Kevin Carson. I tend to agree with him that he was a little more objective than Charles Koch was in describing Koch Industries. But the point is, you can find that, by the way, Kevin Carson's commentary on a Center for a Stateless Society, c4ss.org, and 4 is a numeral, not written out. So I think there's a number of angles to see, and I think, again, if someone is interested in liberty, they listen to this show, they can also look at some of these references, and there's a lot to learn, maybe a little behind the scenes there. Let's move on. Let me get my order right here so I stay on. Yes. 10 questions libertarians can't answer and hope you won't ask. That is an article that I thought was interesting. I don't know from what perspective, is not strictly from comedic, but it's interesting how poorly understood the libertarian philosophy is. And there was a tie into the Koch brothers, and that's one of the reasons that this really caught my eye. I just wanted to, this is from a website entitled bleedingheartlibertarians.com. And again, it's entitled 10 Questions Libertarians Can't Answer and Hope You Won't Ask. It's written by, I assume, a fellow named by Jason Brennan. And it was dated today, April 8th, 2014. And he starts out, I got to read some of this because this is just a little too much. He says, libertarianism philosophy is like a cockroach that scurries away once you shine the light of reason on it. Here are 10 hard questions libertarians can't answer. So I want to go through these, and I'm going to give the very short answer because I want to give an answer, and I'd be happy to talk about this in much greater detail on later shows. Hopefully sometime when Brad's joining me. But at the moment, number one is, which Koch brother has more authority over you? We all know libertarians take their orders from the Koch brothers, and that libertarian intellectuals are just hired guns for the Kochs. But what if the Kochs disagree? With whom must they side, Charles or David? Obviously David being the other brother. Is it just the high bidder? And I didn't even thought of this up until now, but I just cited an anarchist libertarian who was disputing what Charles Koch had said in his response. So clearly the anarchists, the libertarians, are not in lockstep with the Koch brothers. In fact, in history, I know Murray Rothbard had his troubles with the Koch brothers, and they had a major split at one point. And I don't get the whole thing is, so libertarians take their marching orders from the Koch brothers. How do they do that? And I guess libertarians are just robots and we just follow whatever they have to say. I don't know. How do you dispute our contemporaries, Robert Higgs, Hans Hermann Hoppe, etc.? These guys seem to be coming out with new ideas, or at least putting ideas together in new ways. All the fellows at the Mises Institute, etc. I don't see how that could be the case. Certainly, there's overlap in some of the ideas. I would argue some of the people I just cited, Murray Rothbard, etc., are pure in their thoughts, and I don't see any contradiction, any incoherency in what they espouse or what they had espoused. So I don't give much credence to that whatsoever. No doubt the Koch brothers probably have given some money to libertarian leaning, I guess, policies. But that doesn't change the philosophy or really affect the philosophy. I would argue they're probably inconsistent libertarians. So, yes, they give money to every policy that they want to support. Some of those are libertarian. So, yes, the libertarian position gets some backing from them in those cases, but not as by and large. Otherwise, they'd be probably the largest donors to the Mises Institute and places like Center for Stateless Society, which I don't believe they support a stateless society anyway. So, doesn't make any sense. Number two is, which corporation should rule the world? And I'm not even going to dignify that with continuing to read that. Many libertarians have come forward and said, well, society probably wouldn't look like it does today had we really been free in 1776. In other words, if there was no state. But as a result, if we really were free, we really had a free society at the time, we had no state, well, corporations likely would not have remotely gotten to the size that they have for a number of reasons. Maybe Dr. Gary Chartier would be the best guy to talk to on that topic. Again, he's been on the show before talking about this kind of stuff. So in the previous example, maybe about drilling in Pennsylvania, well, that obviously wouldn't happen without the long arm of the law making it legal for the drilling company to do this. So again, the authority of a corporation would be, or its ability to draw favors would be completely wiped out if the state didn't exist. So I don't understand that one at all either, as I guess redundantly, I don't understand any of the 10, and that's why we're going over it. When oppressing the poor, this is number 3, when oppressing the poor, is it better to use kicks or punches? Or should you hire other poor people to beat up poor people for you? And this one goes on, this is why libertarianism is so unrealistic. It's all grandiose, visionary nonsense without a sense of strategy. Real political movements know that success is about execution, and while libertarians clearly want to execute the poor, they don't have a good theory about just how to execute them. And there's two things kind of wrapped in there. He's talking about political movement, and yes, there is a chunk of libertarians that are in the Libertarian Party. I happen not to be one of those, and I think there's a fair chunk of people who are not. Jacob Hubert, again, was on this show, and says he does not believe ultimately a free society will be achieved using the electoral process, the judicial process, etc. This will happen completely outside the state. But I did want to comment on the poor, and that libertarians really want to take advantage of the poor or make sure they have no way of becoming not poor, wealthier, I guess. And I think probably the sector of society that would be helped the most by the elimination of the state would be the poor. It's probably the middle class and the poor that have the greatest financial burden of supporting the state. Obviously, the ultra wealthy even take away 50% of their wealth, and they're still going to remain wealthy. It's the poor and the middle class that can't take that kind of hit, and they obviously are. So they would probably be best off without state. Now, I know to many people listening, they hear, well, wait a minute, the poor people are the beneficiaries of the welfare state, and that's the only reason they could survive. And there's a whole long laundry list of reasons why that's not true. In the short term, for things to get cut off like a light switch, yes, it would certainly be tough on them. There'd be a realignment of all kinds of markets. There'd be new markets created. Markets that exist today would probably go away. So there'd be a massive realignment in the economy. So there's always some short-term pain in that transition. Again, we could do a whole show on how the poor would maybe benefit the most from a free society. Number 4 is one I find always interesting, and if you're so smart, how come not everyone's a libertarian? And the real short answer is I think most people don't even know what libertarianism is. And I think even the few people who know what it is have reservations about it. They don't really know how society would work if it were free, which, again, I understand that someone who doesn't have that level of understanding, they see that as a legitimate question. I see that as a crazy question because, again, I see the state as a criminal gang of thieves like Rothbard did. And you'd say, well, how could society function without a criminal gang of thieves? The short answer is way better. Clearly, I would be better off if I wasn't stolen from. I think most people would argue they'd be better off if they weren't stolen from, especially in a systematic way. And then number 5 is also kind of in that same vein is, wasn't America libertarian in 1850 or at least 1870? And isn't America in 2014 clearly better than American in 1850 or 1870? And I think he should be saying, isn't America 2014 clearly better than America 1850, so it's a typo on his part. But this neglects the advances in technology, right? To say that, oh, we're better off than we were in 1850, and that's your recipe for saying why libertarianism doesn't work. First of all, I'm not necessarily agreeing that we were libertarian in 1850. We were certainly freer then than we are now. But of course, we have access to technology and capital that didn't exist back then. To say, oh, aren't we better off now than we were then? See, libertarianism doesn't work. It doesn't follow by logic. It works on a lot of people, but it's not logical. How could a libertarian society produce new generations? And he just says libertarianism is a philosophy only for old white males. And I don't know. My short answer there would be I refer you to the people, the vast majority of people that had followed the Ron Paul campaign for presidency. It was overwhelmingly young people. So I can't even understand that premise, but other than for argumentative purposes. And I get, for argumentative purposes, it probably works because people hear that 2 seconds and they run with it. If Murray Rothbard was such a badass anarchist, why did he work for a state university? Well, everyone needs to work in a certain to a certain capacity. The problem is the university level is almost a monopoly by the state. So if you are going to work in academia at a higher level, you're almost forced to. Now, if he could have found an option and he didn't take it, I don't know what his justification would or would not be for it. Everyone has to make a decision on that. But that does not mean that libertarianism can't work because Rothbard worked for, I believe it was University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So again, doesn't work for refuting the case for libertarianism. And he says, come to think of it, how can libertarian, this is number 8, by the way, come to think of it, how can libertarianism ever get going without stealing from the government? And he says, libertarians think all taxes are theft. That he's actually got right. But to go and vote libertarian, they have to drive on public roads. For them, this means stealing from the corporations and the rich people. So I think what he's trying to say here is, wait, if you ever use anything that was available from the public sector or made available by them, that makes you a hypocrite. Well, maybe that's true, except for the problem is there's no alternative. There's very few private roads. Once the state monopolizes an industry, your only alternative is to not use that industry. And of course, the state is very good at monopolizing crucial industries. One, I would argue, they call it money. So you can call everyone who claims they're an anarchist to be a hypocrite because at some point in their life, I assume they used the U.S. dollar if they were born in this country. Again, that does not refute libertarianism. That really highlights the problems with monopolizing crucial industries, that you have no choice. But again, if for argumentative purposes, it probably works for people to hear a 30-second soundbite and not think about it. Which political leaders will you put on your currency is number 9. And he says bills have to have pictures of political leaders. Well, of course they don't. And that obviously he's just having a little fun there. But that is just so ridiculous. I think he was struggling after maybe 4, 5, or 6, and he just had to have more to get a top 10 list. And he writes, number 10 is, if capitalism is so awesome, why is anyone still poor? I don't even know where to act. I would argue the real reason why people are poor, or the biggest reason, not the real reason, or at least one of the bigger reasons, I think it's probably the biggest, is because the state confiscates most of your wealth. That's what tends to make people poor, even if they're highly productive. If someone's taking everything from you, or some entity is taking your wealth, that tends to make you poorer. Another kind of absurd statement in his facts here, but 10 questions libertarians can't answer and hope you won't ask. I was hoping to have a good discussion with Brad on that one, but he's not available this evening, so I just had to go through that by myself. But nonetheless interesting, and that's at bleedingheartlibertarians.com, again written by Jason Brennan. With that, I wanted to go on to kind of a recap or follow-up of the things we spoke about 2 weeks ago, and which was really the fundamentals of liberty. And of course, that's a wide-ranging discussion. We're kind of all over the map, which you maybe always are in that case. Just the demands of the subject kind of put you there. But one of the things that Brad made mention of on numerous occasions is, but Tom, we voted for it. It should be okay if we voted for it. And I want to cite this book, Beyond Democracy. Excellent book for the people who are not philosophical. I think it's a little more practical, and in that regard, it may relate to more people than philosophy. I would argue, as I always do, that philosophy is very important. It's the glue that binds all these different positions together, and it also serves as a guidepost for you as you go on to analyze different arguments, non-aggression axiom and the respect for property rights, or more specifically, private property rights. In this, the two authors in Beyond Democracy talk about basically how democracy is by definition a collectivist system, and it certainly is. It puts decisions in the hand of the state, and most people say, well, of course, some decisions need to be made by the state. I understand that that's a popular position for people to take, But if we change that around or use like, should the state be in charge of shoes? And likely if they were, it's kind of a one size fits all, right? It's the state decides, are they going to make red shoes, brown shoes? Are they going to make boots? Are they going to make sneakers? The state is not the one that is the supplier of choice. By definition, the state is a monopoly on a given geographic area. So monopoly is a reduction in choice, not an increase in choice. So I think to expect the state to provide superior choice is to expect the opposite of what you're going to get. Let me just read a little bit from this book, Beyond Democracy. It says, the authors say thus: democracy is by definition a collectivist system. It's socialism through the back door. Yes, because what is, in a sense, socialism is what the state decides. And people don't see this in a democracy as the state deciding if they vote on it, right? That they look at it and say, we all decided. But it still is one way for everyone, where the free market is the antithesis of that. It is everybody gets to vote. You vote with your dollars. You support the companies that, in this example, provide the shoes of the color, size, style, etc. that you approve of. And that's how you get shoes of almost an endless variety. Imagine if the state was in charge of music and they decided that only classical or only rap or only hip-hop or whatever would be the music supplied by the state. I think people would be very unhappy with that. The whole point is that's what we're getting today with the court system, with our police protection, with our protection by the Department of Defense, which is a misnomer, but anyway, that's another long story. He says clearly then it is misleading to claim that democracy is somehow the inevitable climax of the political evolution of mankind. That's just propaganda to disguise that democracy represents a very specific political orientation, for which there are indeed plenty of reasonable alternatives. One of those alternatives is called freedom. And then he goes on to talk about voting and a number of other things, and I just want to move along here. In fact, couldn't it be the case that this very fact that we decide on everything democratically, that virtually all economic and social issues are controlled by or through the state, is the underlying cause of the many things that are wrong in our society? That bureaucracy, government meddling, parasitism, crime, corruption, unemployment, inflation, low educational standards, etc. are not due to a lack of democracy, but rather that are caused by democracy. I think he talked about the public education. I think many people would argue that public education is substandard at best. It happens to be controlled by the state, right? Even a local community votes on it, and the school is going to teach or not teach a certain curriculum, right? It's a one shoe size fits all. If you want, again, alternatives, if you want choice, you have to go to the free market to find that. So he talks about, I think there's 14 myths of democracy. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the first one he says, every vote counts. And he goes into a bit of analysis of, there's about 100 million people in the United States that vote in presidential elections. But if you have a 1 in a 100 million influence on the outcome of a process, or 0.0000001% in practice, that's like essentially no influence. So the chance that your vote is the one that decides who will win an election or not is astronomically small. I think it was Rothbard who's gone into this in more detail, and I think they even do in this book. It escapes me at the moment. But even you are voting for a person or some type of representative. First of all, they're not legally bound or contractually bound to what they say is what they'll actually advocate for once they're in office, right? So you have an agent that you're not bound to, or that agent is not bound to you or to any agreement. Let alone if you have a 1 in 100 millionth chance of casting the deciding vote on someone. So you have basically no say on a candidate, and even if your candidate does win, you have no way of compelling to do what they claimed they were going to do before the election. Myth number 2 is entitled "The People Rule in a Democracy." This is the basic idea of democracy. It's what democracy literally means, government by the people. But do the people really govern in democracy? In that section on myth number 2, he talks about basically the idea of an agent, and that you're actually not voting on issues by and large. So you're not voting on policy. You're voting for an agent who's not bound to any agreement whatsoever. He says, to justify the representational system, it is argued that A, it would be impractical to hold referenda on all the many decisions that the government has to take every day, and B, people do not have enough expertise to decide on all kinds of complex issues. Just taking up B for the moment, so these other fellas are representatives, and there's some gals there too. We're now to assume they're more competent than we are. And if that's the case, if we're not competent, how could we determine who's more competent to handle these matters? There's so many fallacies wrapped up in there, and it's much better stated in this book that I'm doing. So now I would encourage everyone to check this out. Defenders of democracy will perhaps argue that even if people are not stupid, no person has sufficient knowledge and intelligence to take decisions on the complex issues that deeply affect the lives of millions of individuals. That is undoubtedly true, but the same goes for the politicians and civil servants who take those decisions in a democracy. For example, how can they know what kind of education parents, teachers, and students want? Right? Again, this is the claim that these representatives have superior knowledge than we do. Everyone knows that governments regularly take decisions that most people oppose. It is not the will of the people, but the will of the politicians, prompted by groups of professional lobbyists, interest groups, and activists, that reigns in a democracy. Big oil, big agri, big pharma, big medicine, the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, they all know how to work the system to their advantage. A small elite takes the decisions, often behind the scenes. And again, that's what the system is. Many people will say they don't want corporate influence, or they think that's what's wrong with democracy. But as soon as you have favors available for sale, they'll ultimately will be for sale, of course. It's those who can exert greater influence on that. In other words, if I have more money than you have, I can put greater influence on the politicians to be more likely to get what I want out of the system, where the small fries, the little guys, don't have that available to them. So again, I'd say most people are misguided in thinking ultimately it's the big corporations that are a problem. Again, I'm not arguing that they're angels, but I'm saying they're using the long arm of the law to get their way. If we eliminated that, they wouldn't have that, be able to use that leverage over us. Myth number 3, and this is, I think, a very important one: the majority is right. For the life of me, I don't understand why just because a majority of people support something or voted for something means we should do it. I've used the example countless times on the show that I'm sure we could get a majority together that claim that we should take Bill Gates' money. More or less is going to be one against the rest of us. But that doesn't make it right, of course. It just means that a majority would like to have his money, and they can use the long arm of the law to make him hand over his cash. So people just don't really, I think about what the system is, the flaws in it. And once you get to that point, you're at a better spot where you can think more clearly, I think, about a free society. Again, that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish here on the Annoying Peasant radio show. Let me move on. Democracy is politically neutral. He says democracy is compatible with any political direction. After all, the voters determine the political preferences of the party or parties in charge. Thus, the system itself transcends all differences in political outlook. It is in itself neither left nor right, socialist nor capitalist, conservative nor progressive. That's how it seems anyway. Yet this is at best a half-truth. In reality, democracy does embody a specific political direction. And I think this is an important idea he is coming up here. I'm going to read this. Democracy is by definition a collectivist idea, namely the idea that we have to decide everything together, and all must then abide by those decisions. This means that in a democracy, pretty much everything is a public matter. There are no fundamental limits to this collectivization. If the majority, or rather the government, want it, they can decide that we all have to wear a harness when walking the streets because it is safer, or dress up like clowns because it would make people laugh. No individual liberty is sacred. This leaves the door open to ever-increasing government interference, and ever-increasing meddling is exactly what happens in democratic societies. And don't be fooled by the politicians that say they favor the free market either. And I think this was well written. He says, consider the Republican Party, which is often considered the party of free enterprise. They have come to embrace virtually all the major interventionist policies advanced by their leftist rivals: the welfare state, high taxes, high government spending, public housing, labor laws, minimum wages, foreign interventions, and added some of their own, such as subsidies for banks and big businesses, and laws against victimless crimes such as drug use and prostitution. But of course, they have the rhetoric down for supporting free enterprise or the free market, which they don't. One of the things which they don't actually do, I apologize. One of the tables that he has in this book early on shows the government spending by percentage of gross domestic product, and he shows from 1870 to 2009. Very interesting, some of the figures. In 1870 in the U.S., government spending as a percentage of GDP was 7.3%. By 1937, it had grown to 19.7, continued in 1960 to 27%, and virtually on a straight line. And today, or in 2009, the latest figure available here, it's 42.2%, which is low on this smattering of countries he has here. Just to point out a few, in 2009, again, the USA was at 42.2%. Switzerland, which I would have guessed was much higher, is actually at 36.7%. Japan, 39.7%. And then you have the countries at the other end of the spectrum: France at 56%, Italy at 51.9%, Sweden at 52.7%, the Netherlands at 50%, Austria at 52.3%. So certainly we're not the worst off in that category, but certainly not one of the better ones there. The American Revolution started as a tax revolt by American colonists against the mother country, Great Britain. The founders of the United States liked democracy just as much as they liked high taxes, which is to say, not at all. The word democracy does not occur anywhere in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution. Just thought that was kind of an interesting fact. Another thing about, how the regulations and laws have exploded. Another telling example can be seen in the Code of Federal Regulations. Some of you may find this interesting, which lists all laws enacted by the federal government. In 1925, this was just a single book. In 2010, so 1925, a single book. In 2010, it had mushroomed into more than 200 volumes, of which alone, by the way, the index takes up more than 700 pages. It contains rules for everything under the sun, from how a watch band should look to how onion rings should be prepared in restaurants. Just during the presidency of George W. Bush, 1,000 pages of federal regulations were added each year reports The Economist. According to the same magazine, from 2001 to 2010, America's tax code grew from 1.4 million words to 3.8 million. Just amazing. Number of pages in the U.S. federal tax code in 1913, 1939, it's almost zero. It's very few. By 1974, we're just under 20,000 pages. By 1995, that doubled to 40,000 pages. 2004, we're at 60,000 pages. And again, in 2011, approximately 70,000 pages. That's just federal tax law. Just thought that was a little interesting tidbit. One could argue, I'm again citing from this book, Beyond Democracy, one could argue that in recent decades, freedom has advanced in a number of sectors. In many Western countries, private commercial television companies have broken the monopolies of national broadcasting stations. Opening hours of shops have expanded. Air traffic was deregulated. The telecoms market was liberalized. And in many countries, conscription was abolished. For those of you who don't know what conscription is, it's a draft, a mandatory draft. However, many of these achievements had to be wrested from the hands of democratic politicians. In many cases, these changes could not be stopped by politicians as they were the result of technological developments such as the media or in telecoms, or of competition from other countries, as in the case of airline deregulation. These developments may be compared to the collapse of communism in the former Soviet Union. That did not happen because those in power wanted to give up their power, but because they had no choice, because the system was broken and could not be fixed. In the same way, our democratic politicians regularly have to surrender bits of power. So, of course, at the same time, they're trying to gain authority. In some cases, they're having to give it up. They don't have any choice. He says, the real freedom is the right to choose not to participate in the system and not to have to pay for it. As a consumer, you aren't free if you are forced to choose between different TV sets, no matter how many brands you can choose from. You're only free if you can decide not to buy a TV set. In a democracy, you have to buy what the majority has chosen, like it or not. Myth 5 is democracy leads to prosperity. I guess I should read some of that. Many democratic countries are wealthy, and therefore people often think that democracy is necessary to achieve prosperity. Actually, the reverse is true. Democracy doesn't lead to prosperity. It destroys wealth. That's something we talked about on this show numerous times. Murray Rothbard, I think, is one, and certainly Ludwig von Mises has said many times that the only thing that the state has at its disposal is force. And force, is by definition the destruction of wealth. So that's the only thing the state can actually do. And I know people want to argue and say, no, they've done some things, they've built some bridges, they've done some things, but they can't do that without first using the coercion to take that wealth from someone else. And in that balance, what would have been produced or could have been produced by the private sector versus what was produced by the state is a net loss in wealth. So it is the destroyer of wealth. And again, we could take shows and numerous shows to illustrate that point. He points out that some Western democracies are in fact prosperous. I don't want to read too much of the book for you, but let me move on to the next one. If you're interested, again, book is entitled Beyond Democracy. I strongly encourage anyone to take a look, and I'm moving on. Okay, myth 6. Democracy is necessary to ensure a fair distribution of wealth and help the poor. He says, but isn't democracy necessary to ensure a fair distribution of wealth? Politicians often talk of solidarity and fair sharing, of course, but how fair are their schemes really? To begin with, before wealth can be distributed, it must be produced. Government subsidies and services are not free, although many people seem to think so. Roughly half of what is earned by productive people is taken by the government and then redistributed. And again, who do they distribute to? Well, there is some necessary disbursements. I think they would argue that they have to get their votes, but they in general would prefer to give as much as they can to the political elites, the cronies, their friends. And they don't necessarily have to hand them cash. They can hand them favors in exemptions to laws. Like I believe the Affordable Care Act has recently had a number of exemptions created by executive order. And I know most people will think, well, he's just trying to help people out. Well, look closely and see who's being helped out by a lot of those executive orders. People would be astonished by what goes on there if they took the time to really research it and understand what's happening. And he does in the book here cite special interest groups are very motivated to preserve benefits, while the great mass of voters are too busy to bother. That's one thing that people have to also understand is something that costs every voter, say, $1, and that money's distributed to one of the political insiders' friends or something. The likelihood of a lawsuit being brought by an individual is low because they say, hey, the cost of bringing a lawsuit is way outstrips the cost of handing over the dollar. So it's difficult to reverse these things, especially when the cost is shared, but the benefit is, of course, concentrated in the hands of a very few. Myth 7, democracy is necessary to live together in harmony. People often think that conflicts can be avoided by making decisions democratically. After all, if everyone only follows their own inclinations, you can't live together in peace. So this argument goes. This may be true when a group of people has to decide whether to go to the movies or to the beach. But most questions don't need to be decided democratically. In fact, democratic decision-making more often than not engenders conflicts. This is because all kinds of personal and social issues are turned into collective problems in a democracy. By forcing people to abide by democratic decisions, democracy leads to adversarial rather than harmonious relations between people. Good point there that's brought forward. Again, the more decisions that are made by individuals and not democratically or by a vote means you'll likely have a greater variety in options. And I think that's where conflicts are avoided. And conflicts are in fact created when people are forced to go along with how everybody else does things. This is a little interesting, and of course interesting to me because I've run across this many times. He says it's no coincidence that political discussions between people are often so emotional. In fact, many people prefer not to talk about politics when they meet socially. This is because they usually hold very different ideas on how to live. And in a democracy, these views somehow need to be reconciled. I think that's a very important point because, again, in a free society, if you think everybody should be driving Volkswagens and I think they should all be driving Volvos, in a free society, you can drive your Volkswagen, I can drive my Volvo. And I know people are sitting there listening now, well, we can do that today, Tom, so no advantage. Again, maybe just a poor example. The whole point is I think everybody should go through the same court system. Well, in a free society, there would likely be numerous different arbitrators that we could use to resolve cases. And ultimately, given that, those arbitrators would have to compete to arbitrate more efficiently and more effectively and even more fairly. On a continual basis, they would have to innovate. And obviously, that incentive does not exist for the court system today. By and large, you'd look at the technology. The court reporter. There's a court reporter a stenographer who types today, which I don't know how long this has been going on, a long, long time. If this was a competitive market, I could believe that somebody would have moved along to technology that converts the voice to the written word, obviously by computer, and the stenographer would be removed, thus reducing the costs. That's just a very tiny example of how things could be done. Obviously, that doesn't change the resolution of justice, just the way the action is recorded, but just one that comes to mind off the top of my head. Many things likely would be done. I would argue the same in the realm of education. We've been receiving education by and large the same way for hundreds of years or more. I think there would be a lot more room for innovation. Of course, it's happening to some degree today. People will point to it and say, see, it happens anyway. I would argue it would have happened long time ago, and we would be much further along in being innovative in educating kids. Again, the public education system to me is a one shoe size fits all. And if there's, one thing that rubs me is people will say this, that, everyone's an individual. My son is unique. Your son is unique. They're also unique. And then next thing they do is they go to the school board and they try to enforce that all sons and daughters have the same education and they learn the same way. Not just the curriculum, it's how they're taught. It's all done the same way. And I don't know how that squares with my son and your son being a unique individual. I don't quite follow. But again, I think most people don't really think about this stuff. Let me move on here and see if I can find the next myth that he lists. Just like myth 8. Democracy is indispensable to a sense of community. He says, in a democracy, then, every difference in opinion leads to a struggle for power. I think that's really important that people see. As long as it's decisions are made in the public realm, right, there's going to be a giant struggle for power and resources, with one group gaining at the expense of others. Everyone makes demands on the state, and the state forces other people to meet those demands. It can hardly be otherwise, because the state is, after all, nothing but an instrument of power that operates by coercion. Again, I think that's a way to support, not only it is ruins community because it places neighbor against neighbor. It also leads to conflict instead of conflict avoidance, which is, of course, something that Hans Hermann Hoppe speaks about very eloquently in probably almost every one of his books. Myth number 9 is democracy equals freedom and tolerance. One of the most persistent myths about democracy is that it is the same as freedom. For many people, freedom and democracy belong together like the stars and the moon. But in fact, freedom and democracy are opposites. In a democracy, everyone must submit to government decisions. The fact that the government is elected by the majority is irrelevant. Coercion is coercion, whether it is exercised by the majority or by a single ruler. That might be his best point to these myths that he's listing here. I just want to go through that again. Again, he's making the point that people think freedom and democracy are the same. He's making the point that they, in fact, are opposites. But he says, in a democracy, everyone must submit to government decisions. The fact that the government is elected by the majority is irrelevant. Coercion is coercion, whether it is exercised by the majority or by a single ruler. And I think that's where many anarchists really support that. Again, the non-aggression axiom and private property rights. I've heard Dr. Walter Block say, anarchists are maniacal in their application. I think, he's being a little bit funny with that, his description there. But what he's trying to say, they're consistent with it, and they're the only ones who are consistent. There are many who are not, or almost all are not, and that's why people see anarchists as uncompromising, which is also kind of weird because they see anarchists as uncompromising philosophically, but then they see anarchism as chaos where there's helter-skelter and there's no order, so there must be all kinds of compromising going on there. But again, on the show, Brad and I have talked before that, the kind of compromise that people are talking about is incompatible with these decisions that need to be made. Like, I would argue I'm compromising when it comes to how many murders should be happening in, say, the United States in a year. I think the number's 0. And people say, well, why can't you compromise and just think, 400 is fine? on the subject of stealing. How much stealing should we compromise on? How much stealing should be allowable? How much should be tolerable? I would argue no. Stealing is stealing. It's a violation of property rights, and it should not be tolerated. It should be subject to sanction because it is in fact a violation of property rights. There shouldn't be any exceptions. There should be no compromise there. It's not a compromisable position. If you and a friend each want something to drink, but you want something different, and you've pooled your money together and you can only afford one drink, well, then you might need to compromise or might be willing to compromise. But that's an entirely different matter than compromising on issues of ethics and morals. Myth number 10, which is, I think, the last one I'm going to go, might be the last one I'm going to go over tonight, is democracy promotes peace and helps to fight corruption. And I know many Americans, if not overwhelming majority, believe that the United States is a peace-loving nation. Of course, I had thought the same thing for many years until I did further research. He's got a paragraph here that I think is very relevant to this. Again, it's myth 10 is democracy promotes peace and helps to fight corruption. In the international arena, democratic states are almost by definition the good guys, and the others are bad. Democracies are, after all, peace-loving, aren't they? Well, not exactly. All too often, democracies show themselves to be pretty warmongering. The United States, the most powerful democracy in the world, started dozens of wars. The American government carried out numerous coups, overthrew governments, supported dictators. He lists a bunch: Pinochet, Marcos, Somoza, Batista, the Shah of Iran, etc., and dropped bombs on defenseless civilians, even atomic bombs. Currently, the U.S. has troops in more than 700 military bases in over 100 countries, spending roughly as much on defense, he has it in quotes, as the rest of the world combined. And again, I know the detractors will say, well, because you don't understand, it's a dangerous world. But you have to look at this a little more closely and understand that the impetus for many of these wars was the United States. And that's just if you can look at this objectively. If you can't, you can't. You'll maybe come to a different conclusion. He has a graphic here that's kind of interesting. It's got a B-52 bomber that's dropping a number of bombs in a still shot, obviously. But on the top it says, if you don't come to democracy, on the bottom, of course, where the bombs are, it says democracy will come to you. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And, of course, a lot of information can be transmitted in just that one little graphic. Myth 11, people get what they want in a democracy. The basic idea behind democracy is that people get what they want, or at least what the majority wants. In other words, we may complain about the results of our democratic system, but ultimately what we have now is what we wanted because it's what we democratically chose. And I have to thank Tanya for putting something up on the Facebook page there, the George Carlin quote, something like, don't complain now, something like, you wanted a master, you got one. And I think that's very relevant to what we're talking about here. For example, we can assume that everyone is in favor of better education. This is his way of saying that we don't get what we want in a democracy. Again, for example, we assume that everyone is in favor of better education, yet we're not getting better education. What we get is harassed teachers, violence in schools as learning factories, students who are no longer able to read, write, and do arithmetic, but not better education. But how can this be? It is not because of lack of democracy. On the contrary, it is the result of how the democratic system works. The fact that education is managed through the democratic system means that politicians and bureaucrats dictate how education is organized and how much money is spent on it. It means that the role of parents, teachers, and students to choose for themselves is minimized. State intervention means that schools and universities are inundated with plans, requirements, rules, and regulations from the Department of Education. This bureaucratization makes education not better, but worse. When people then complain about the the quality of education, politicians respond by implementing even more regulation. What else can they do? Again, citing what Mises had said, that they only have one tool at their disposal, and that's the use of force, coercion. The idea that they should end their interference does not enter the minds of politicians and bureaucrats. If they stopped meddling, they would implicitly admit that they are superfluous or even counterproductive, which they will never do, of course. It is not in their interest to do so, and incentives, of course, I've said on this show many times, plays a giant role. The new regulations make the problems worse because they further restrict the role of students, parents, and teachers. They also lead to more bureaucracy and even create perverse incentives. For example, in the Netherlands, schools were required by bureaucrats to teach a minimum number of hours, ostensibly to ensure the quality of the education. But this did nothing about the shortage of teachers the schools suffered from. So schools were led to keep pupils sitting in the classroom doing nothing for hours. That the government would try to manage by numbers is not surprising. From a distance, the only thing you can measure is quantity. Quality is seen only by those directly involved. The democratic system can be compared to the state factories in the former Soviet Union. These were centrally controlled and managed on the basis of numbers. Despite, or rather because of, all the attention they got from the state, the quality of production was poor. No communist car could compete with Western models. This was because production was controlled by bureaucrats, not consumers. How can bureaucrats know what consumers want, and what incentives do they have to improve? The central planning in the Soviet Union brought little technological or cultural innovation. I would argue the same thing is true of our educational system, of the court system that we spoke of a little earlier already on the show. How many inventions were made in communist countries? Quality and innovation are the result of competition and choice, not of central control and state coercion. Anyway, that's all I'm going to go over for this show. I just wanted to talk about some of those points because I think they're relevant to a variety of aspects of the state and to a free society. Hopefully next week we'll have our audio all figured out and we'll be in good shape to have Brad join me and have our regular show. But we'll wait and see how that plays out. We'll work on it diligently and we'll get that going. So with that, till next week, I want everyone to know that I thank them for listening, and we look to improve the show vastly in the coming weeks. Everyone have a great evening, and again, thanks for listening. Good night.